Hey, Composer Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about form and structure in drum and bass. So, let's get started. Now, what are you talking about, form and structure? What does that really mean? Does it mean there's one formula? So I want you to think about like maybe several stores that all sell the same products but have very different structure layouts. They have different buildings. They have different rooms for different purposes, different things. Maybe one building's got a bigger room for selling product, and they have maybe a few showcase rooms on the side, and then maybe a storage area, while another one may place emphasis on the storage area, have a smaller showcase room but have more little rooms on the side for those individual presentations. Like, it just depends on what it is that you're doing. We can have different structures, and we notice with this analogy that there are pieces that each one has. They just place emphasis differently. They use them differently. Structure is actually really simple. It's just the way what you put in the structure. That's when things get complicated. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, I don't know the structure. When in reality, they're probably having problems with bass, melody, and the idea of the piece that goes there. So we're talking specifically about the layout. So, okay, let's talk about this. So now we've got an intro right here. Sometimes you have something called a sub intro to introduce the content in the intro. This really becomes more a battle of understanding what we put here. Now back it up, just back it up right now. We need to talk about something first. Drum and bass, based on the way that it was emerged, did not have like some sort of formal idea about, or at least conscious idea about how song structure should work. If there was one, it would be linked to hardcore mostly, but things got really experimental. And by the time we get to breakcore, there's a complete breakdown of form. There's still ideas, but they're very, very loose, fluid ideas, mostly about rhythm and fragmented melody. It's no longer about, an actual track. When you get into like liquid funk and stuff, it sort of pulls back to the popular genres. That sort of pulls back to having a form. So you got to keep in mind, there's stuff over here with like very little form and stuff that was developed because a lot of this was getting written. So therefore, because there was a lot, consistencies began to appear, and now we have structures. So we're going to be talking mostly about those structures because the mindset and the way you approach a genre like breakcore is totally different than the way you would approach this kind of a genre. You still look at it in chunks, but the chunks don't have to line up the way they have to line up in typical drum and bass. So, okay. So you start out with an intro. Maybe you have a sub intro to introduce the content in the intro. The intro serves the purpose of usually just introducing a rhythm in drum and bass and melodic idea, something you're going to develop. Usually it is a repetitive theme, or otherwise known as a motif, not necessarily a theme. A motif from my music theory series is the smallest musical idea that you can identify. That's a motif. So you introduce a couple of those things. You begin to like do stuff here. Then you reach, we could call this one the jam, the break, whatever you want to call it. You have some sort of a movement that happens. This would be, we'll call it for our sake, just a verse. Sometimes drum verse, and sometimes drum and bass has movements that have actual verses in them. Especially like things like I believe Pendulum has a couple tracks where there's a lot more vocals that would be more typified of a song with verses. But in drum and bass, a lot of it's all just drums and bass, and that's it. Freaking get rid of the voice. So it just varies upon what you're going for, what you're writing. Now I wrote this at the 8th bar, right? So here's bar 8, and then bar 9, the new phrase starts. So that is another thing that's consistent. That doesn't necessarily hold true for later stuff, but even in breakcore, they do usually follow something like this because it's really tough to create any kind of rhythmic idea, unless it gets so messy that it sounds like noise. That's like the thing you want to avoid. That's kind of what that genre challenges. So and like liquid funk and stuff, they definitely do things in sets. And because their tempo is so quick, they can happen in 8 bars, but typically they're done in sets of 16. So 16 bars. Now, even then, when you have something like this, most drum and bass songs, not even then, most of them move in sets of 16. Like if you were to take apart the songs and look at them, you'd be like, oh, 16, 16, 16, 16, 16. There's just a lot of numbers of 16 because 8 bars at this tempo is not very long at all. So we'll get here. We'll have our verse. It serves to introduce. So we introduced some ideas here, but they're like little playful ideas. This section is great to introduce things that you are going to mess with. If you're going for something a little more free form, in this area, you may consider throwing out ideas that you may repeat later but will not be developed, meaning you will introduce ideas here, phrases and such, but they will not occur during the verse to sort of taunt the listener at all. They just appear over here, and then you bring them up. You don't leave them there, because if you leave them there, it's kind of weird and unfinished. But if you bring it up, it's like the listener is like, oh, it's called a recapitulation. I believe that's like the official name for it. But you're like, oh, look at that thing. Oh, that, I remember that from the beginning. And they sort of have this moment where they're like, hey, so there's two ways. So in the verse, you could now you're introducing like your main content, your main sounds. Your song is generally jamming. That's one method of going about this. Another thing that could happen instead of having a verse is you instead could have a rise of some kind. So you could use your intro. You could extend your intro out, developing ideas the entire time. So technically you'd still be going into a verse, but it would be prolonged to get to a rise, because you're going to use the rise to build momentum, to build suspense, and it doesn't always mean speeding up or creating like the big sounds that get louder and louder and louder. Typically that's what happens, but I've seen some phenomenal rises that just get louder in general just by using space. They make it sound really big, but not loud. It's really cool. And then you'll typically have, so this will be, a rise will be 16. Normally a rise is not that long, but if you want to be elaborate, you could throw on another elaborate rise thing. But then you'll have a breakdown. Usually, sometimes you go straight into it, but you'll have a breakdown. So you have intro, and then you develop ideas. Verse, typically you either go verse or rise. So you rise maybe a little bit, depending on the subgenre, you'd be versing it. Then you get to the breakdown. The breakdown is this one, it's just like one moment where you have like the drums do something wacky happens there. Something crazy that everyone's just like, whoa, man, like no one saw it coming. I have this whole theory about how something is funny, and something is typically funny when first off, you cannot have a perception. You have to misunderstand it in some way for it to be funny. It has to be something that you're like, why would that happen? Like, that makes no sense why that happened. And the people that throw at me all the time as a counter argument, inside jokes. There's something socially there that you just don't get. It's still funny, and you can't explain why. Otherwise, it would be an inside joke. Or if you do explain why, it's like say for some reason you guys find the word bananas funny, it becomes an inside joke. You just don't understand bananas. Like, you just don't understand. You are marveling at the fact that you can connect an idea like that, and every time it just blows you away because you get it in a way that it's just funny to you. So I have this idea about that. That's sort of what the breakdown is for. You put something there that people are like, oh man, like they live for that moment. So you got to make that one worth it if you're going to do it like that. Sometimes people like to subdue and go straight into the drop. That's fine too. Do whatever you want. But this is just general structure. So we're looking at the tools we have as a structural thing. We have a breakdown, we have a rise, we have verses to work with. Okay, so we do this. This will typically, the breakdown will happen, and then you will have, as what many people will call the drop. I like to call it, especially in drum and bass, the jam session. Because what will happen is you'll have your breakdown. Typically, this will also shift everything one measure. It's still 16 bars of 16 though. Almost without exception, this stuff's going to happen in bars of 16. So once you hit your jam session, this could go a number of ways. Like, this is like a big part of what separates some genres from others, is how they deal with this idea of the jam session. And that is, or the drop, as some people say. I like the term jam session because it's not, the drop to me is like you have like you literally drop. In this one, you're just like boom, boom, boom. You're just going for like you're just going crazy. And you throw in your sub and your bass and everything's like going full blast. Like they just were like blown away by your impressive, crazy breakdown, or you subdued them into the drop and everyone is just feeling it. They're just going up and down. This is when, if they're listening to it in the car, they accidentally run a red light because they were so into your jam session that they just could not be stopped. So that's the kind of jam session that like ideally you want for when people just really get into it. A lot of people will use as a riser. They'll use the riser as a chance to introduce huge melodic content. Look at the Spore remix of the Chemist Stomp Box that was on the list. So hopefully you listen to that stuff, because like that's man, I'm sorry for you if you didn't listen to it, because it's some of my favorite stuff. So it's like so good. Okay, anyways, if you listen to it, one of the differences between the original Stomp Box by the Chemists and the remix by Spore is that it has that huge boo boo. Like he has this insanely huge bass, and he totally uses it later. Like it's a great chance to introduce melodic content. The smoother, the more integrated you can be, the more you can put things together and use them in new ways without creating new content, the less stuff you'll need in a track, and the more evenly your track will sound. They will create consistent interest in new ways of looking at the same material, and it'll be easier to mix. It'll be easier to master. It's easier to comprehend. Like it's just all around better generally, unless you don't want to do that. If you want it to sound jumbled and rushed and ragged and just lots and lots of stuff with a complicated mix, that's typically the way I do some. Like, I don't know. Recently, I've been into that kind of a thing. It's like borderline trance type stuff, because it's not quite breakcore. It's not nearly fast enough. It's definitely drum and bass. So, yeah, we're not talking about that right now though. Okay. So we got done with the jam session. Now you go back to either your verse, whatever content you introduced in your intro typically, or you have some sort of a bridge. So if this thing's off just a little bit. If I zoom in, there we go. So you'll come out, you'll finish that jazz, and I'm going to stick to I know this is supposed to be one bar over because we had a breakdown, and occasionally I'll have breakdowns between these things to help the sections move better. You don't need every breakdown, and every breakdown doesn't have to be like a measure after the phrase ends. You could have it be the end of the phrase, end of the drop. You could have it be silence and then half a beat, or you could have the breakdown simply be one beat. It just depends on what material you're writing. So after you get through there, you reach your verse. This is all bars of 16. Like it's really simple, like 8 or 16, because I've never looked it up, but I've not heard a song unless you're talking and like typical like neurofunk drum and bass that's not in some sort of simple meter. Now there's like crazy syncopations that happen with breakcore and stuff, but I'd even wager that stuff is typically in no, never mind. I read stuff contrary to that about how this wasn't Kraftwerk. Who was it? Someone was using 7/8 bars and stuff. So that's not true. Never mind. Okay, so we get to the verse, we talked about that. The bridge, so after your jam session, and you could go back to the intro material, or you can introduce some new material here. However, you got to be kind of careful about how you introduce new material, because when you introduce new material, new textures, it either needs to blend with previous textures or be related in some way, and you got to find a way to incorporate it, unless you have some way of creating some catchy thing that just no one saw coming. Oftentimes, if it fits the form of the song, meaning the mood of the song, the textures are sort of similar, but they're new textures, and they build and morph into the original. That's really organic. People dig stuff like that. They're like, oh man, it's like this flower just dropped a seed and it grew into a new flower. But it's similar to the old flower after it grew, but the growing process was new. So it's that kind of a thing. So you get there, you typically hit another jam session, and you'll have a bridge, and you can either go straight back into the jam, or you could go do another rise and then end. Like honestly, now you know the pieces, you just like put stuff there. It's just understanding the fundamental idea that an intro, every song's got to have an intro. Like I suppose it could start right at the drop. That'd be a pretty wild example, and it's got to sound like you just dropped. It can't, like, typically the drop is where you present your main idea. So I don't know how you would do that without having some sort of like a sentence or phrase or something. One note would be considered an intro. So if you guys know of a song that just goes straight to the drop and it's very perceptibly the drop without any sort of introduction, I'd be interested to hear that. However, I feel like people who comment are going to be ones that misunderstood what I just said, and there'll be like some note or something right there, and I'll be like, nope, it's there, right there. Look at that. It's not it. So, okay, that's that. And then sometimes they'll have an outro. They'll move it over here, pretend this is outro. It'll go, then you'll have some sort of an outro. So, and depending on the tempo, because you can change tempos, and depending on your structure, you may have things built out. So your jam session may be, instead of 16, well, typically it won't be 16. It'll be like 32, but some people have jam sessions as long as like 64 bars, like really long, but it's got to be good material. You don't want to get bored. A lot of people make mixes that are boring. Like there's not enough going on. Sometimes that's the point of the genre, is to get lost in the music. So it's not so much fun to listen to, but in the context of a DJ mixing it with other stuff or just playing it by itself, everyone's just, feeling it. So that's okay too. Sort of like a Boiler Room set only for drum and bass. Then I associate Boiler Room sets with like deep house. Okay, so if you guys know of Boiler Room sets that have drum and bass, I didn't know that was like a thing, so that's kind of cool. But right now I just associate it with sort of deep house, that kind of a thing. So intro, so there you go. Those, I don't know what else I could say here. That's pretty much the pieces that you have to work with, and those are the ideas you need to be aware of when you're working with them. As you get your vision, you've gone out, you listen to a song, you have an idea you want to express, and you maybe have some cool sound design ideas. You can then put them down and begin to formulate your song. That'd be kind of cool. So if you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day. I show you, I made a little drop. I got a little carried away. So this da na 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 is actually a variation on this patch, but right here, if I change this to like 5, like just that.